My parents literally chose a $30,000 birthday cake over my daughter's heartbeat. They watched me drown while they toasted to their own vanity, and now they're at my gates, shivering and begging for a mercy they never gave. I'm Lord's, and I didn't just survive their fire. I became the one who controls the flame. To understand why I'm about to let them freeze, you have to see the night the masks finally shattered. I can still feel the suffocating weight of that evening, a darkness that didn't just fall, it collided with the city. The heavy November rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Peninsula Hotel, blurring the Chicago skyline into a smudge of charcoal and neon. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sterile, metallic tang of filtered air. I stood at the threshold of the rooftop ballroom, my cheap yellow raincoat shedding a pathetic puddle onto the white marble floor. I felt like a puncture wound in a room full of silk. I scanned the crowd, my eyes landing on the center of the orbit. There was Sable. My sister looked radiant in a custom-fit emerald gown that likely cost more than the heart surgery my daughter needed to survive. She was laughing, her head tilted back, a flute of vintage champagne trembling slightly in her manicured hand. Every light in the room seemed to gravitate toward her, leaving me in the cold, gray shadows of the entryway. Have you ever looked into the eyes of the people who raised you, only to find a total stranger staring back? That was the sensation that crawled up my spine as I spotted my father, Gerald. He was holding court with a group of investors, his silver beard neatly trimmed, his posture radiating the kind of old money confidence that had always been the Palmer family's greatest weapon. He used to tell me, "Lords, a Palmer always pays their debts." I realized now, watching him laugh at a joke from a local senator, that his integrity was a performance. It was a currency he only spent on strangers, never on his own flesh and blood. I forced my feet to move. My wet boots squeaked against the polished floor, a high-pitched, rhythmic sound of poverty that cut right through the smooth, live jazz. Heads turned. Guests in sequins and tuxedos paused their conversations, their gazes sweeping over me with the clinical detachment of people looking at a bug on a wedding cake. I didn't care about their judgment. I couldn't afford to. Every heartbeat Lyra had left was a ticking clock I could hear inside my own head. I reached the main table where my parents sat. The center of the table was dominated by a 5-tier cake, iced in gold leaf to celebrate Sable's 35th birthday. $30,000! I knew the figure because the event planner had bragged about it on social media. $30,000 for a night of vanity, while I only needed $20,000 to keep my daughter's heart beating. "Lords," my mother, Vera, whispered. Her voice didn't carry warmth, it carried a warning. She didn't look at my face. She looked at the damp hem of my jeans. "What on earth are you doing here? You look disheveled. You're making a scene." "Lyra is at Portland Memorial," I said, my voice sounding hollow and metallic to my own ears. I pulled the medical bill from my pocket. It was crumpled, damp from the rain, but the numbers were clear. "The congenital defect has worsened. The doctors say without the surgery in 48 hours she won't make it. I need $20,000 for the down payment. Please." My hands were shaking as I laid the paper on the white linen tablecloth. I waited for a gasp of horror, or for my mother to reach out and take my hand. Instead, she leaned back, her pearls gleaming under the chandeliers. She looked at the medical bill as if it were a soiled napkin. $20,000, she said, her voice dripping with a terrifyingly calm condescension. "And you come here on Sable's night, smelling of the hospital and the street? You've always been so dramatic, Lords, trying to steal your sister's spotlight with another one of your financial crises." Gerald didn't even look up from his phone at first. When he did, his eyes were as cold as the lake water outside. "We've discussed this. You chose your path when you married that mechanic. You chose to live outside the safety net we provided. Now you want us to subsidize your lack of planning? This isn't about planning, Dad. It's about Lyra's life," I pleaded, my dignity stripping away like old paint. "She's your granddaughter." Sable floated over then, her emerald skirts rustling. She didn't look angry. She looked bored. "Lords, really? It's my birthday. Can't you just be happy for me for once, instead of bringing your broken heart stories into the room? It's so exhausting." My mother picked up her glass of vintage Bordeaux. She swirled the dark red liquid, watching the legs of the wine slide down the crystal. A Palmer child with a broken heart is a failure of lineage, lords. Perhaps it's nature's way of telling us that some branches aren't meant to thrive. You're just using this to extort birthday money because you're jealous. Then came the moment that changed me forever. Vera slowly tilted her hand. I watched in slow motion as the dark red wine poured out of her glass, splashing directly onto Lyra's medical documents. The white papers soaked up the liquid like a sponge, the ink of the doctor's signature bleeding into a dark, ugly red stain. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Something inside me simply went silent. It was a cold, sharp, snapping sound. The final thread of the girl I used to be, breaking under the weight of their cruelty. I realized then that I wasn't being ignored. I was being erased. They had decided that my daughter's life was a stain on their perfect aesthetic, something to be washed away with a glass of wine. Gerald pulled out a leather checkbook. For a fleeting second, my heart leaped, but he didn't hand the check to me. He signed it and handed it to the event coordinator standing nearby. 30,000, he said loudly, ensuring the nearby guests could hear his generosity. The flowers were magnificent, Marcus. Ensure the staff is tipped well. He turned back to me, snapping the checkbook shut. Investments are for the successful, lords, not for the reckless. We don't throw good money after bad. Now please leave before I have security assist you. You're ruining the mood. I stood tall. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a witness. I looked at the three of them, the golden sister, the porcelain mother, the granite father, and I saw the rot beneath the gilding. I thought about the words I'd once heard, that forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about refusing to let their poison live inside your house anymore. You taught me that everything has a price, Father, I said. My voice was no longer trembling. It was quiet, steady, and heavier than the storm outside. I used to think you were a man of integrity, but today, you finally showed me your true value. You've shown me exactly what your soul is worth. It's exactly $20,000. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't look at Sable's shocked expression or my mother's indignant huff. I turned and walked toward the exit. My boots still squeaked, but I didn't feel like the sound of poverty anymore. It sounded like a drumbeat. I stepped out into the Chicago rain, the cold water hitting my face. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Kaylin. I knew the storm was only beginning, but as the elevator doors closed on the gilded world of the Palmers, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. Blood makes you related, but loyalty and sacrifice make you family. When the foundation is rotten, the only way to save the house is to walk away. I was walking away from the ruins, but I was walking toward the light of my daughter's survival, no matter what it cost me. The Monday morning sun fought its way through the Chicago smog, casting long, skeletal shadows across the pavement of River North. I stood outside the Palmer Luxury Furniture Showroom, my hand resting on the heavy brass handle of the front door. Every muscle in my body felt like a guitar string stretched to the point of snapping. 36 hours remained. 36 hours for Lyra's heart to wait for a miracle I wasn't sure I could provide. Have you ever felt the weight of a life in your hands while the people who gave you yours tried to crush it? It's a burden that changes the way you breathe. I stepped inside, the scent of expensive cedar and lemon oil hitting me like a physical blow. The showroom was silent, a vast temple to mahogany and velvet. Gerald was already in his office, the door slightly ajar, a sliver of golden light spilling onto the Persian rug. I had spent my childhood seeking warmth in that office, only to realize later that it was just a furnace for his ambition. I smoothed my blazer, straightened my spine, and walked in. For a second, I hoped the rain from Saturday night had washed away the cruelty, leaving behind a father who cared. Gerald looked up from a stack of legal documents, his expression surprisingly soft. "Lords," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Lyra." A flicker of hope, dangerous and fragile, ignited in my chest. He pushed a thick folder toward me, filled with papers that looked official and dense. He spoke of a family restructuring loan, a way to provide the $20,000 while protecting the Palmer business interests. It sounded paternal. It sounded like a lifeline. But I wasn't the naive girl who had walked onto that rooftop. I ran my eyes over the first page, my mind analyzing the fine print with the sharpness of a woman who had learned to read between the lines of betrayal. These weren't simple loan papers. They were legal waivers. If I signed, I would be signing away my custody rights to Lyra and granting Gerald full indemnity for any future financial claims. He wasn't helping me. He was buying my daughter. He was treating her heart like a distressed asset in a corporate takeover. Character is fate, and my father's character was a ledger that only balanced in his favor. "These aren't loan papers, Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Gerald didn't flinch. He just adjusted his glasses, the light reflecting off the lenses so I couldn't see his eyes. "Lords, be reasonable. In this country, everything is a contract. I'm simply ensuring the Palmer name is protected from your impulsive lifestyle." He stood up, pacing to the window, leaving the folder open on the desk. He was distracting me, a classic move he used during negotiations to let the opponent sit with their fear. I didn't sit with fear. I used the silence to scan the desk. Tucked under a blotter was a different set of papers, a life insurance policy. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled it out just enough to see the name. Lyra. It was a $500,000 policy, taken out recently with Gerald as the sole beneficiary. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of the desk. The $20,000 loan was never coming. He was waiting for her to die. He was amortizing her death to save his failing showroom. Gerald turned back, his face a mask of calculated concern. "Is there a problem?" I stared at him, my knuckles whitening as I pushed the insurance policy back into hiding. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I felt a quiet power settle over me, a cold, hard shield that blocked out the monster wearing my father's face. I wasn't dealing with a parent anymore. I was dealing with a predator who had calculated the profit margin of a child's funeral. I realized then that my survival depended on being smarter than the man who taught me how to think. "Lords, don't be so dramatic," he added, his voice oily and smooth. "A smart man prepares for every outcome. In business, even a loss must be managed." I looked at him, and for the first time I felt nothing but a profound, icy clarity. I understood that the bridge between us hadn't just been burned. It had been dismantled, brick by brick, by his own hands. I needed to leave, but before I could stand, the office door swung open. Sable entered, her eyes red-rimmed, clutching a small velvet box. She looked like a portrait of grief, her emerald silk dress from the party replaced by a somber charcoal suit. "I couldn't sleep," she sobbed, kneeling beside my chair. "I saw what happened at the party. I saw the wine. It was horrible." She pressed the box into my hand. Inside was a diamond heirloom necklace, an old Palmer piece that had belonged to our grandmother. "Take it, Lords. Sell it at the pawn shop on 4th. It's worth at least $25,000. Just save her, please." For a brief, foolish moment, my heart softened. I saw the sister I used to play with in the garden, the one who shared her toys. I took the box, my fingers trembling. "Thank you, Sable," I whispered. I felt a surge of gratitude, a belief that perhaps there was still a shred of humanity left in this building. I stood up, clutching the box to my chest like a holy relic. I didn't see the look Gerald and Sable exchanged as I turned to leave. I only saw the exit. I hurried out of the showroom, the weight of the diamonds feeling like the weight of Lyra's future. I was halfway across the parking lot when the first siren wailed. 3 Chicago PD cruisers swerved into the lot, tires screeching against the asphalt. My breath hitched. I stood frozen as officers jumped out, guns drawn, shouting for me to put my hands in the air. "Lords, Palmer, drop the box! Now!" The velvet box hit the pavement with a dull thud. I felt the cold, biting steel of the handcuffs snap around my wrists. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare. I looked back at the showroom windows. Sable was standing there, her face devoid of tears, her phone held to her ear. She wasn't crying anymore. She was smiling. It was the most beautiful, terrifying smile I had ever seen. She had reported a grand larceny, a disgruntled, unstable former family member stealing heirlooms to fund a delusion. As they pushed me into the back of the squad car, I watched the hospital clock on the dashboard. The red numbers mocked me. 35 hours left. They didn't just take my daughter's chance to live. They took my freedom to save her. I sat in the darkness of the car, the realization freezing my blood. The most dangerous lies are the ones told with a smile by those who claim to love you. True survival begins the moment you stop looking for a hero and decide to become the one who survives the fire. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the holding cell felt like a swarm of hornets vibrating inside my skull. I leaned my head against the cinder block wall. The chill seeped into my skin, but I welcomed it. It was the only thing that felt real. Outside this cage, the world was moving toward a catastrophe I was currently powerless to stop. Every few seconds, my eyes would dart to the institutional clock mounted above the heavy steel door. Its second hand didn't glide. It jumped, a rhythmic executioner's axe chopping away at Lyra's life. Have you ever noticed how silence becomes deafening when you're waiting for a miracle that refuses to arrive? I sat there, clutching the thin, scratchy blanket, and forced my mind to work. I had to be the smartest person in the room, even if the room was a prison. When the guard finally grunted that I had one phone call, I didn't dial my parents. I didn't waste a single breath on the people who had put me here. I called Kaylin. I didn't cry. I didn't apologize. Instead, I spoke with the clinical precision of a lawyer. I gave him the pawnshop address, the names of the officers who had taken Sable's statement, and the specific legal flaws in the jewelry trap. "Lords, stop." Kaylin's voice crackled through the receiver, thick with an exhaustion that broke my heart. "I'm taking care of it. Just stay strong. The obstacle in the path becomes the path, remember? We aren't going under. We're going through." I hung up the phone, the plastic receiver slippery with my own sweat. A public defender had visited me earlier, his eyes glazed with the boredom of 1,000 lost causes. He told me the bail was set at an astronomical level, $50,000, because of the prominent status of the victims and the high value of the diamonds. My family was using their social shadow to bury me. It was a deliberate, legal stalling tactic designed to keep me behind bars until Lyra's heart finally gave out. While I sat in the dim light of the precinct miles away, my husband was descending into his own version of hell. I could almost feel the heat of the Southside industrial plants through the connection we shared. Kaylin hadn't slept in 48 hours. He had spent the first 24 working a suicide shift at the steel mill, a place where the air tasted like iron and the temperatures could melt the resolve of lesser men. He didn't just work for the paycheck, he worked for every second of Lyra's future. He didn't stop at the mill. To reach that $50,000 bail, Kaylin had done things that made my soul ache. He had sold his 1967 Mustang, the car his grandfather had left him, the only piece of heritage he truly owned, to a private buyer for half its value, just to get the cash immediately. He had even signed up for a high-risk, paid clinical trial at a nearby lab, subjecting his body to God knows what just to bridge the final gap in the down payment. My husband, the man who was once a simple mechanic, had become a titan of sacrifice. The heavy door of the holding cell finally groaned open at 5 a.m. Kaylin stood in the hallway, silhouetted against the harsh yellow lights of the precinct. He looked like a man who had been through a war. His clothes were stained with grease and soot, and his hands, the hands that used to tuck Lyra into bed with such gentleness, were blistered, raw, and bloodied from the grueling labor. When the officer unlocked my cuffs, I reached for him, my voice breaking. "Kaylin, I'm so sorry. The car, the shift, you shouldn't have..." He pulled me into his chest, the scent of smoke and sweat grounding me. "Lords, listen to me," he whispered, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Family isn't the name on a birth certificate. It's not the people who claim to love you while they pull the floor out from under you. It's the person who walks into the fire to bring you home. I'd burn the whole world down if it meant keeping you and Lyra safe." This was the anchor of hope. While my blood family was calculating the profit of a funeral, my chosen family was creating a miracle through the pure, visceral weight of love. We arrived at Portland Memorial just as the sun began to bleed across the Chicago horizon. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and transition. Lyra was already on the gurney, her small, pale form swallowed by white sheets. She looked so fragile, a tiny bird with a broken wing. As the orderlies began to wheel her toward the double doors of the operating room, I watched the version of myself that used to beg for their approval vanish. I realized I could no longer be the person my parents were allowed to hurt. I had to become something else. I walked into the hospital restroom, the bright light stinging my eyes. I looked in the mirror at the woman Vera had always molded. She had insisted I keep my hair long, sleek, and marketable, claiming it was the only thing that made me a true Palmer. I reached into my bag and pulled out the surgical scissors I'd grabbed from the nurse's station. Without a second of hesitation, I began to cut. Thick, dark clumps of hair hit the tile floor like fallen leaves. I didn't stop until my head was shaved down to a stoic, practical buzz cut. I stared at the stranger in the glass. She looked fierce. She looked unbreakable. To be truly free, you must first be willing to be a stranger to those who knew the version of you that stayed silent. I gathered the discarded hair and dropped it into the trash can, a ritualistic disposal of my Palmer identity. I walked back into the waiting room, sat down next to Kaylin, and pulled out a notebook. The surgery would take 12 hours. In those 12 hours, I wouldn't just pray. I would plan. I would build an empire that would ensure my daughter never had to beg for her life again. True power isn't about having a throne. It's about being the person who can lose everything and still find the strength to stand up. I looked at Kaylin's bandaged hands and then at my own reflection in the darkened window. The woman who walked into this hospital was never coming back out. The fire had been set, but I wasn't the one who was going to burn. I was the one who was going to rise from the ashes, and I was going to make sure the world remembered my name. The years have a way of smoothing out the jagged edges of a broken heart, but they never truly erase the scars. 5 years have passed since the night I walked out of Portland Memorial with a shaved head and a vow written in the marrow of my bones. Today, the rain still falls on Chicago, but I am no longer standing in it. I am watching it from the 44th floor of a glass and steel fortress in the Loop. My office at Lyra Strategic Holdings is a study in minimalism, clean lines, open spaces, and an unobstructed view of Lake Michigan. It is a physical manifestation of the boundaries I built to protect my peace. I sat behind my desk, the cool surface of the polished stone beneath my palms. On the corner of the desk sat a framed photograph. Lyra, now 9 years old, her cheeks flushed with health, laughing as Kaylin hoisted her onto the deck of our new boat. She is whole. She is thriving. Every time I look at that picture, I am reminded of the stoic principle that guided my rise. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. I chose to lead this firm with radical transparency and empathy, the very things my parents considered weaknesses. I didn't want to become a monster to defeat monsters. I wanted to become a master of the game they thought they owned. My assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, pulling me back to the present. The forensic audit for the Palmer Furniture Group is complete, Lords. It's on your terminal. I clicked the file open. The numbers told a story of arrogance and decay. My father's empire was a hollow shell, a monument to a world that no longer existed. They were hemorrhaging cash, buried under predatory loans, and desperately seeking a bailout that wasn't coming. Their outdated business model was finally collapsing under the weight of its own vanity. It was as if the universe had finally decided to balance the scales. I scrolled through the acquisition report, a quiet sense of triumph settling in my chest. For the past 3 years, I had been the ghost creditor. Through a series of anonymous shell companies and discretionary trusts, I had been systematically buying up Gerald's distressed assets. I bought his bank loans when they went into default. I purchased the leases on his flagship showrooms when he couldn't meet the payments. I even bought the primary mortgage on the Gold Coast penthouse. I now legally owned the very roof over my parents' heads and the floor they stood on. They had no idea that their merciless savior was the daughter they had discarded like a broken toy. "Lords, the lead attorney is on line 1, my assistant announced. I picked up the phone. We finalized the last of the debt transfers, securing the total control I'd spent half a decade planning. This wasn't about malice. It was a forensic audit of a toxic legacy. I was simply taking back what was rightfully mine. The dignity they tried to steal, converted into equity and legal standing. I didn't feel the heat of anger anymore. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a grandmaster moving the final piece into a checkmate. I had built my own table, and I no longer had to beg for a seat at theirs. Success is the quietest way to tell your story. I don't need to shout to be heard. I just need to be the one holding the key. I stood up and went to the window, watching the white-crested waves dance on the lake. From above, the city looked tiny. The people below were just small dots, struggling with a life full of noise and chaos. I had found my stillness. I had found my strength. But the game wasn't over. The final turning point was about to begin, and it started with a formal petition that had arrived at my desk an hour ago. Gerald and Vera, completely unaware of who was pulling the strings, had sent a desperate request for an emergency meeting with the chief executive of Lyra Strategic. They were coming to beg for a debt extension. They were coming to ask for mercy from a phantom. I spent the afternoon reviewing the forensic evidence of their financial mismanagement, specifically the unpaid life insurance policies Gerald had tried to leverage against Lyra's life. I saw the greed in black and white, documented in ledgers that couldn't lie. Math doesn't have emotions, and neither does the truth. I called Kaylin before the meeting. "They're here," I said, my voice steady. "They're in the lobby." Kaylin's voice was warm, a solid anchor in the shifting tides of the day. "You don't owe them anything, lords. Not even your anger. Just show them the mirror." I thanked him and hung up. I adjusted my blazer, checking my reflection in the glass. The buzzed hair had grown back into a sharp, professional bob. But the eyes were the same. Eyes that had seen the fire and refused to blink. I was ready to face the ghosts of my past from a position of absolute power. My assistant opened the double doors. "The Palmers are here for their appointment, ma'am." I didn't turn around immediately. I let the silence stretch, the weight of the moment filling the room. I wanted them to feel the scale of the world I had built without them. I wanted them to feel the air of a room where they were no longer the ones in control. I had been erased from their lives once. Now, they were about to realize that I was the only thing standing between them and the street. I finally turned. Gerald and Vera stood there, looking stooped and gray, clutching leather briefcases that I knew were full of lies and empty promises. They looked around my office with wide, hungry eyes, impressed by the wealth they didn't yet realize I had taken from them. They didn't recognize me at first. Not in this light. Not in this suit. I watched them through the tinted glass of my authority, unaware that the merciless investor they were about to meet was the same girl they had left shivering in the rain. That's where the final reckoning started. The invitation was embossed with gold, a heavy cardstock that felt like a summons to an execution. I stood before the full-length mirror in my dressing room, smoothing the silk of my midnight blue gown. This wasn't just a charity gala at the Art Institute of Chicago. It was the final stage for a play that began 5 years ago. I checked my reflection, making sure every line was sharp. My bob was sleek, my eyes steady, and my heart, once shattered, felt like a diamond, compressed by immense pressure until it was unbreakable. I reached for my clutch, feeling the weight of the digital tablet inside. Have you ever walked into a room knowing you held the truth like a hidden blade? It's a terrifying kind of peace. Kaylin walked in, looking dignified in a tailored tuxedo, his hands no longer scarred but strong. "You ready, lords?" he asked, his voice a low anchor. I took a breath, the scent of expensive perfume and anticipation filling my lungs. I nodded. Success isn't just about what you gain. It's about the dignity you reclaim from those who tried to bury you. We stepped out, ready to face the ghosts under the blinding chandeliers. The grand staircase was a sea of sequins and false smiles. As we entered, the air changed. People whispered, not about the Palmer's troubled daughter, but about the guest of honor, the woman whose foundation had funded 100 heart surgeries in a single year. I saw them across the room. Gerald, Vera, and Sable. They looked like remnants of a forgotten era, their clothes slightly too tight, their jewelry likely rented, clutching champagne flutes as if they were life rafts. They were here to finalize Sable's engagement to Julian, a tech billionaire who valued legacy and pure reputation above all else. I watched Gerald's face as he spotted me. For a moment, his mask slipped, revealing the raw smell of desperation beneath his cologne. He whispered something to Vera, and they began to glide toward me, their faces twisting into practiced expressions of parental pride. "Lords, darling!" Vera exclaimed, her hands reaching out to touch my arm. I stepped back, my movement as clinical and precise as a surgeon's incision. I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound, professional detachment. "Mrs. Palmer," I said, my voice cool and hollow. "I believe you're mistaken. My name is Lords Winters. I suggest you enjoy the appetizers. They're the only thing in this room you can still afford. The truth does not cost anything, but a lie must be paid for eventually." I saw Sable watching from the stage, her arm linked with Julian's. She looked triumphant, a pillar of family values according to the brochure on the tables. She thought she had outrun the fire, but a mirror was about to be held up to her soul. I turned my back on my parents, leaving them standing in the middle of the aisle, their fake warmth freezing into confused resentment. I moved toward the podium, the digital tablet heavy in my hand. The room went quiet as Julian took the microphone. He spoke of his love for Sable and her impeccable character. He called her his moral compass. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. In the United States, your reputation is your collateral. And Sable had been trading on a forged currency for too long. I stepped onto the stage just as he finished. The crowd murmured, Sable's smile faltered, her eyes darting to my face. "Julian," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the high-end speakers. "Integrity is a forensic audit, not a marketing slogan. You deserve to know who you're inviting into your house." I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I simply tapped the tablet and the massive screens behind the stage flickered to life. I showed the room the official Chicago Police Department records from 5 years ago, the fraudulent grand larceny report Sable had filed against her own sister. I showed the timestamp, 11:47 p.m., the exact moment I was begging for my daughter's life. She didn't just abandon me, I told the silent, horrified audience. She used the legal system to attempt to imprison me while my child's heart was failing. Is this the family values you're investing in? The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. I watched Sable's face crumble, the emerald of her dress suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Julian didn't look at me. He looked at the police report, his brow furrowed with the shock of a man who realized he had been played. He pulled his arm away from Sable as if her touch were toxic. "Julian, it's not what it looks like!" she shrieked, but her voice was thin and hollow against the weight of the evidence. He simply walked off the stage, leaving her standing under the spotlight, a queen with a crown made of glass. Gerald surged forward, his face purple with rage. "You've destroyed her. You've destroyed this family," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I saw him as he truly was, a small man terrified of his own reflection. "I didn't lose your status tonight, Gerald," I said, my words like stones falling into a deep well. "You lost it the night you decided a $30,000 party was worth more than Lyra's heartbeat. Math doesn't lie. You spent your soul, and now the bill is due." He tried to threaten me with a public scandal, but I leaned in, my voice lower than the music. "In this country, libel is a very expensive mistake, and I have the best legal team in Chicago. You have a rented tuxedo and a bankrupt furniture store. Don't play a game you can't afford to lose." I saw the first flicker of true fear in his eyes, the realization that I wasn't the girl who needed him. I was the woman who owned him. I showed them mercy by not calling the police for their past crimes, but I made sure the Palmer name was now toxic in every bank and boardroom in the city. I turned to Kalen, who was waiting at the foot of the stairs. He took my hand, his grip solid and warm. "Is it done?" he asked. I looked back at the ballroom, where the crowd was beginning to whisper and move away from my family as if they were a contagion. "It's balanced," I replied. We walked out into the cool Chicago night, leaving the blinding lights and the rented jewelry behind. As we stepped into the car, I felt the final chain of the past snap. Justice isn't a weapon, it's a mirror. Eventually, the world sees you exactly as you are. 6 months have passed since the gala, and the Chicago winter has settled in with a biting, unforgiving edge. The sky over the Gold Coast is the color of a bruised ego, purple, gray, and heavy with the promise of a storm. I sat in my car across the street from the Palmer penthouse. the heater humming softly. Today was the day the paper empire finally turned to ash. Forensic accountants and sheriff's deputies were moving through the lobby like a slow, methodical tide. I watched from behind the tinted glass as the untouchable life of Gerald and Vera Palmer began to leave the building in cardboard boxes and black plastic bags. A man's true wealth is the good he does in the world. All else is just borrowed glitter. I remembered Gerald saying that once, but he was quoting someone else. A mask he wore to look philanthropic at country club mixers. He never actually believed it. To him, wealth was the mahogany desk, the imported silk rugs, and the way people lowered their voices when he walked into the room. Now, those rugs were being rolled up by strangers in windbreakers. The silence of the street was punctuated by the rhythmic thud of the moving truck's ramp. It felt like a funeral, but for a ghost that had stayed too long. I felt a quiet, heavy peace as I looked at the legal documents on my passenger seat. Gerald had spent his final week frantically calling every bank in the city, begging for a stay of execution. He didn't know that every debt he owed had been funneled into a single entity. As he stood on the sidewalk, arguing with a deputy, I saw his face turn a sickly shade of white. He had just seen the name on the foreclosure notice. The Lyra Hart Foundation. The very entity he tried to profit from by betting on my daughter's death was now the one taking his home. Every cent he lost was legally redirected to fund surgeries for children he would never meet. Looking back, I realized that I felt no joy in their downfall. Joy requires an emotional investment I had long ago liquidated. Instead, I felt the satisfaction of a math equation finally reaching its sum. The money they denied to save one child's heartbeat was now saving thousands of others. That was the only legacy worth keeping. I watched my mother, Vera, clutching a designer handbag as if it could shield her from the reality of the sidewalk. She looked small, stripped of the lighting and the luxury that had acted as her armor. The Palmer name wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a warning label. The confrontation I knew was coming happened 3 days later. I was at a small private park in Lincoln Park, watching Lyra climb a jungle gym. Kaylin was nearby, a steady, watchful presence. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and the coming blizzard. I heard the crunch of footsteps on the frozen gravel before I saw them. Gerald and Vera appeared like specters, their faces twisted into masks of unearned grief and staggering entitlement. They didn't come to apologize. They didn't come to ask for Lyra's forgiveness. They came because they still thought I was a resource to be mined. "Lords," Gerald began, his voice gravelly and stripped of its boardroom thunder. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folder, sliding it onto the park bench next to me. It wasn't a letter of regret. It was an itemized bill of rearing expenses from my childhood. Private school tuition, summer camps, even the cost of the designer clothes Vera had forced me to wear to keep up appearances. "We calculated it," Gerald said, his eyes hard. "With interest, you owe us over $1 million for the foundation we gave you. We're filing for filial support under the state statutes. You have a legal obligation to provide for us." I looked at the bill, then back at the man who had bought life insurance on my dying daughter. The audacity was almost breathtaking. They still saw me as a financial asset, a return on an investment they felt they hadn't fully collected. Vera stepped forward, her lower lip trembling in a practiced show of vulnerability. "We have nowhere to go, lords. We're your parents. You can't just let us starve while you live in that mansion. Think of how this will look in the press." She was still trying to weaponize the shame I had outgrown years ago. I remained unmoved, the intelligence they once praised now acting as my unbreakable shield. "Math doesn't have emotions, Gerald, and neither do I said, my voice calm and steady. "I legally repaid every debt the Palmer name ever incurred when I bought your bankrupt notes. In the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of God, we are paid in full. You spent 30 years teaching me that everything is a contract. Well, the contract is over. You breached it the moment you poured wine on my daughter's medical bills." Vera tried a different tactic. She turned toward the playground, her voice rising to a high, melodic pitch. "Lyra! Lyra, honey, come see Grandma." I stood up, moving between them and the playground like a wall of iron. My presence was a physical boundary they could no longer cross. "Don't," I said, the word a low, dangerous growl. You don't get to use her peace to fill your void. You are strangers to her, and I will keep it that way. The grandmotherly mask Vera wore slipped for a second, revealing the jagged, selfish creature underneath. I didn't let them leave empty-handed, not because of love, but because of the human decency they never showed me. I handed Gerald an envelope containing the keys to a small, modest apartment in a humble part of the city and a basic monthly stipend. It was enough for a quiet life, but not the gilded one they craved. I will not let you starve, because I am not you, I told them, my voice finalized. But I will also not let you in. I have finally learned to love myself more than I fear your disapproval. This is the last time we will speak. Setting boundaries isn't an act of hatred. It's an act of self-preservation. You can't pour love into a bottomless pit. I watched them walk toward the parking lot, Gerald clutching the keys to a life he considered a failure. Vera still staring at her reflection in the dark window of a parked car. They had been thrust into the position of needy people in the life of the woman they had once tried to erase. I returned to the playground, where Lyra was laughing as Kaylin pushed her on the swings. The stillness of winter felt familiar, like home. The wind howled across the frozen plains of Illinois, a record-breaking blizzard that turned the world outside my windows into a chaotic swirl of white. But inside our home on the outskirts of Chicago, the air was still, heavy with the scent of roasted pine and the crackling warmth of the fireplace. I sat on the plush rug, watching the firelight dance across the room. Lyra and Kaylin were tangled in a string of emerald lights, laughing as they tried to reach the top branches of a tree that touched the ceiling. Success, I realized, wasn't about the number of zeros in my bank account. It was the ability to build a fortress where the people I loved were safe from the storms. I watched Lyra stretch her arms out, her movements fluid and strong. Beneath the soft fabric of her Christmas sweater, I knew there was a faint, silvery line, a scar that served as a quiet testament to her survival. It wasn't a mark of trauma anymore. It was a miracle we had built with our own hands, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. Kaylin looked over at me, his eyes soft and knowing, reflecting a decade of partnership that had survived the furnace. I didn't need to say a word. Family is not whose blood you carry, it's whose hand you hold when the world goes dark. A soft chime from the security system echoed through the hallway, a digital ripple in our peaceful sanctuary. My heart didn't race. I didn't feel the old familiar knot of panic. I simply stood up and walked toward the console. The external cameras showed the iron gates of the estate, nearly buried in snow. Two figures were standing there, hunched against the gale, their expensive coats looking flimsy against the American winter. Gerald and Vera. They had spent the last of the stipend I gave them on a futile legal appeal, trying to claw back the empire they had already squandered. Now, they were back at the gate. I watched them through the high-definition lens. They were shivering, clutching a faded, gold-rimmed family photo as if it were a shield. They were hoping to weaponize nostalgia, to use the ghosts of my childhood to guilt their way back into my warmth. I looked at their desperate faces and felt nothing but a profound, stoic indifference. Boundaries are the highest form of self-love, and I had spent 5 years learning how to build them out of iron. I wouldn't let their toxic winter extinguish the fire I had fought so hard to light for my husband and child. I put on my coat and walked to the heavy oak front door. I didn't do it out of weakness or a need for their approval. I did it because every story needs a final, definitive period at the end of the sentence. I opened the door just enough to face the freezing wind. Gerald looked up, his face gaunt, his eyes rimmed with the red of the cold. "Lords," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Please, it's Christmas Eve. Blood is thicker than water. Give us one last chance to be a family again." I didn't answer with a speech. I didn't waste my breath on arguments they would never understand. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a laminated document. I handed it through the gap in the door. It was the $500,000 life insurance policy Gerald had purchased on Lyra's life while she was dying in that hospital bed. I watched his eyes scan the paper, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The rehearsed sob Vera was preparing died in her throat as she saw the evidence of their ultimate betrayal. "You bet on my daughter's death to save your business," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and utterly final. It carried no hate, only the weight of a settled debt. I bet on her life to build my soul. We both got exactly what we deserved, Gerald. I forgive you for being who you are, but I choose to be who I am. And who I am is a woman who no longer has a place for you at her table. Vera reached out a gloved hand, but I didn't flinch. I just looked at her. Goodbye, Vera. Goodbye, Gerald. I pulled the door shut. The heavy thud of the oak meeting the frame felt like the closing of a tomb. I turned the deadbolt, the mechanical click sounding like the final note of a long, discordant symphony. The Palmer legacy ended in that silence. I leaned my back against the door for a single second, breathing in the scent of my own home, the warmth of the fire, and the safety of my daughter's laughter. The coldest place wasn't the street outside, it was the life they had chosen to lead. I walked back into the living room, shedding my coat. Lyra ran over to me, her eyes bright with excitement. Mom, look! Kaylin got the star on! I lifted her up, feeling the steady, healthy beat of her heart against my chest. It was the only rhythm that mattered. Closure doesn't come from an apology you'll never get. It comes from the moment you stop waiting for one. The greatest revenge isn't a strike. It's a life lived so well that their presence no longer has the power to move you. The blizzard continued to rage outside the window, but the house remained lit and quiet. The three of us huddled together, while the world outside froze. I stared at the fire and finally let go of the last vestiges of the girl I once was. I was no longer running from the past. I was standing in my future, and the only sound echoing in the wind was the silent strength of a woman who had finally found peace. Blood ties only bring you together, but loyalty and sacrifice are what make a family. I chose to stop being a victim so my daughter could have a hero, and in doing so, I found the peace they never had. I know many of you have faced your own storms and had to make difficult choices. Have you ever had to close the door on a toxic past to protect your future? Share your story with me in the comments. I'm reading every single one.